Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers and sisters, welcome to episode number 12, which we have entitled, what have we entitled this one?
Recapping 2020.
Recapping 2020. We went through a number of different titles, but essentially we're looking at the year of 2020 in the news and some key events, trying to work through it chronologically, looking at the fires, looking at COVID, impeachment, some other issues with America and China, Black Lives Matter, and perhaps we can touch on some of the other issues towards the end of the year as well, such as the Beirut explosion, Armenia, Azerbaijan. And there's so much to get through, but we'll see how much we can manage to get through and just sharing our thoughts on some of those key events. So stay with us as we walk you through 2020 as it happened.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back. So let's have a chat about 2020. First off, though, I want to ask you, what do you reckon about this whole worst year in history thing that's going around? Like everyone's saying 2020 is just the worst. In fact, that started from like not even just now, but around the middle or even like the first quarter of the year, people were already saying 2020 is the worst.
Yeah.
Like, what's your take on that? Do you think it's actually that horrendously bad? Is it that different to every other year? Yes, of course, it's COVID, and that sort of marks it. But is it really that, like, horrendously terrible in the scope of human history?
Yeah, I think it's a good place to start. I want to share two thoughts on that. I think the first one is that how bad was it?
Yeah.
And I think it's one thing. It's hard to say that. Like, it's hard to even hear that when you, and you're not charging that you're putting it in this particularly, negative way. But you can't really brush it off like that. Yeah, sure, a few people died, but is it really that bad?
No. But okay.
I think it was obviously, like we've said, we were having a chat before going live. In terms of how bad the virus has been, it's been one of the worst in human history. One of the worst in human history. Okay,
but if you look at, like, you can even look at YouTube videos and whatnot that compares it to other pandemics. And yes, it's been bad, no doubt. But it's been, like, relative to human history, the rest of it, it's been so much more controlled. Like, obviously, at this stage, it's, all over the place. But there's ways to address it that human beings didn't have prior. Anyway, without getting to, like, too COVID specific, because we'll get onto that later. But, yeah, like, you don't think it's at all exaggerated?
I don't know how you can say that. Like, I'm
not putting a position for
that's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying when you say how bad was 2020, let's not talk about COVID.
Okay, I don't mean let's not, but let's not specify COVID.
How do you do that? Like, how is that? That's not possible.
Are people saying that 2020's worst year ever only because of COVID?
Pretty much. What else?
Well, they've been saying many other things. Like for example, one of the things that I've come across mainly on like social media and whatnot is that people call 2020 worst year ever because of, or sort of...
It's either COVID or the implications of COVID. It's a lockdown.
No, there's more. There's more, like celebrity deaths, for example. Kobe Bryant, right?
Come on.
No, but honestly...
That's got to be a byline somewhere. It's got to be a footnote.
People are like, Kobe Bryant's died, 2020 is the worst. Like, honestly... And there's been these kinds of things.
No reputable media thing can ever say that and get away with it.
Not media, but I'm talking about social media. I'm talking about general perceptions. Like 2020's been a bad...
I wouldn't even share my thoughts on that. Like, that's how dumb I think it is. Like, one celebrity, the rest of humanity. How many deaths have we had
from COVID? There's been, I think 750 million or something. No, not...
It's a pretty big figure,
right? Yeah, I think so. Something like that.
It's a pretty big figure.
Wait. Have I got that right? I don't know if I've got that right. No, that's too many. 750 million, it can't be. That's way too many.
We had Anyway, I'll get you to look up the exact
I'll have
figure.
a quick check.
But point is, right, however millions have died as a result of it, I wouldn't waste more than what we've already wasted on this conversation saying, you know, or giving any airtime to opinions that say, you know, what do you think about Kobe Bryant dying and therefore 2020 being the worst year? Or, yeah, there've been deaths, you know, in sporting celebrities, in cricket, in basketball. There've been others. To be honest, I don't even remember them because I'm not a massive follower of those celebrities. But I think just to look at some of the stuff we've said, number one, I don't think you can talk about 2020 outside the I don't even think you can have a conversation. Like, I might seem a little bit pushy on this point,
Okay,
but I don't think we can have a...
Pause 1 sec. COVID death toll apparently is around 2 million at the moment. 2 million, roughly. It seems, as of January 11th, so today, it seems like 2 million.
Yeah.
Which is huge.
Yeah, obviously.
Massive.
That's like, imagine, it's hard to even visualize this, but the typical attendance at a Hajj, the total attendance is about 2 million.
That's crazy, subhanAllah.
Just imagine all those people from all those people around the world. Anyway, look, my general thoughts on the whole 2020 being, I have two thoughts on it. Number one, you can't divorce the issue of COVID from 2020. I think like you can't talk about 2020 without making it all about COVID. I think there've been some important, obviously, developments outside of that, and judging by your facial expressions, you seem to disagree. But if you look at
Not really.
2020, its implications, and then the way that the scientific world has tried to respond to it, and then the conspiracy theories around that, and you know, all that have pretty much occupied all of 2020, like the years past in that much. But I think what's important is, you know, I can say or you can say whatever we want about how the year went by, but I think that the way that some people speak about it, and then some Muslims sort of borrowing from that terminology of just cursing 2020, of saying it's the worst year ever, you know, and there's obviously been a lot worse. There've been TV shows that talk about, you know, death to 2020 and using expletives to describe the year, whether that's in memes or just everyday talk as well. I think there's a really beautiful hadith that we can look at, which is hadith Qudsi, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, La tasubbu dahr. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do not curse time, for I am time. And there's an explanation of that. Imam Nawawi explains that, saying that it's a metaphor. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not time itself. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created time. But he explained it by saying that when the Arabs used to curse time, and this is so interesting because Imam Nawawi is explaining this obviously well before COVID happened, but his explanation of it when he says that when the Arabs used to curse time, they would do it in times of disaster or disease, like where, you know, in our time now, in times of death, old age, loss of money and whatever else, they would say woe to time. It's a form of cursing on or inveighing against time.
I guess you could analogize to 2020's the worst.
Absolutely, yeah. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, in light of what that custom at the time, do not curse against time because Allah is time. Meaning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that brings about death and old age and distress and disease, whether as a form of punishment or whether as a form of trial. He brings those about, and so by cursing those things, you are directing that curse towards Allah. He is the one who causes them to happen. Here the word time means an age, a zaman. Right? And time cannot subsist in and of itself. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates it. It's a series of events that pass one by, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates those events. And so I think as Muslims, you have to think of that hadith when you talk about 2020. Can't just be, you can't sort of rattle those expletives or that loose language off without thinking twice and thinking, you know, should I? SubhanAllah.
So I just want to confirm. So you agree that 2020 is an exceptionally bad year? I
think if we can say it's a bad year, it's a sad year, I would prefer just say it's a year that was full of sadness. It's a year that was full of misery and death and destruction and whatever else. I wouldn't go to that next level and start cursing it as a result or talk about it as the worst year ever. You know, there might be a fine line. Worst year ever might still be a description, like it's purely descriptive. It's not like, you know, you're not passing judgment over it, except to say that in your short life, that has probably been the one that's most full of disaster and stuff. But yeah, I'd probably err on the side of caution and just say, yes, it's been a year that's been full of sadness. And
look, I think it'll go down in the history books. Like
100%.
it will 2020 will be known as the year of COVID,
Yeah.
and it will always have that mark next to it. But yeah, like you could say, even looking at things even more politically, there's certainly been political happenings and so forth, but things like wars, for example, have there been large-scale conflicts and wars, particularly in Muslim lands and things like that? Because other years have been far worse, you could argue, for the Muslim world than 2020.
Yeah. And in no short part because of COVID.
Yeah,
They've not been able to mobilize their armies and,
And so they decide to do their coups at home.
Yeah. I really like
With
that
the
description.
Capitol building.
Yeah. 100%. Like, I guess as a result of armies not being able to mobilize themselves and so forth, they've kept their incursions,
And their violence.
Internal. So, you're right. I see where you're going with that. Fires that had started, like literally and metaphorically speaking, continued to burn. So at the start of the year, obviously, it was the sort of consequences of the fires that started in late 2019 continued to burn. I think Australia was one of the worst hit in terms of...
It's one of the worst.
Do you remember
Australia's
this time last year? I wasn't actually in the country, but just before I left, subhanAllah, like the streets of Sydney were just completely full of smoke.
Smog and all that.
It was, we're wearing masks for a very different reason, right? Little did we know we'd have to, resort to these masks in a couple of months and then really keep them on and be fined if we wouldn't and all that. But when I left and I would see these scenes of just smoke taking over, of fires affecting mainstream Sydney, right?
It was like otherworldly. It was
it was very...
What is going on here?
And then, but what I was talking about when I said fires that have been lit, I'm like, like Yemen, for example, has been going through a civil war. And subhanAllah, for them to go through a civil war and for them to go through that drought and to go through that poverty and to go through all of that during COVID.
Yeah. It's like it's layers on layers of trial.
Just crime and misery, death and destruction.
The unfortunate reality is in a place like Yemen and many parts of the Muslim world, unfortunately, the extent of mismanagement is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so it's not like you're going to be well managing a particular aspect of things and then something else comes and you manage that best you can. It's mismanaged issue here, disastrously, another disastrous mismanagement, and just lump them all together. And unfortunately, it's just dire circumstances.
Yeah, for sure. With these fires, how do you see them? Like I've read online and I've heard of people talking about, I think people sort of, whether it's fires or some other kind of natural disaster, they view it in one of like three ways. Either they just don't have an attitude towards it, it's just like whatever, just ignore it, whatever it is what it is, Mother Nature doing her thing and whatever. Or then there's a sort of there's a sort of worldly way of looking at it. It's like a consequence of global warming and that sort of thing. We need to be more careful as a community, be more green and all that sort of stuff. And then there's I guess I don't want to compartmentalize it and say you can't do both, but there is a sort of more spiritual way of looking at things in terms of it being a warning from Allah.
Reminder, warning.
And a reminder and a warning from Allah. How do you see it?
Look, I think, like you were saying, I don't
just
think
marry
you
the two of them.
Really compartmentalize it. It's a bit of everything.
Can I then, if you think it's both, can I sort of
compartmentalize it anyway?
No, can I sort of test your grit on the whole it being a global warming thing?
I'm not like taking a staunch position.
I know, but
I'm saying perhaps it could be.
Okay.
But yeah, go ahead. Let's try it.
With the whole global warming thing.
Yeah.
How much of a consequence do you think the world's big corporations and the world's biggest criminals when it comes to carbon emissions?
Yeah.
How responsible do you think they are for things like the fires that we witnessed in Australia and elsewhere in the world?
Assuming, taking the narrative that, global warming is a key issue and it is something that is impacting the planet, then there'd be huge accountability on those corporations. But unfortunately, they're also the ones who are able to get off and sort of commit these kinds of things without having much accountability and without really having much blowback fall to them. Yeah. I'd say they'd be accountable if indeed they are the ones who are pumping the pollutants into the atmosphere and it's causing all these issues. Of course, there'd be huge responsibility, but I don't know, like it's in the narrative. It's further than that as well. It's that they are responsible to a significant degree, but then there's like emissions from things like cars, farming, things like that as well that contribute. Now, I don't know the specific percentages that corporations do X amount and everyone else does X amount, and you know that's how you work it out. Yeah.
But okay, that's still something to work off. You'd say, you know, there's the general emissions, and then there's there's corporations that are like almost criminally negligent with the way they don't manage their emissions as well. And I guess arsonists come into the picture at some stage as well.
Yeah,
because I know
there were a few of them that
in Australia, in Sydney.
That's just horrendous. Like, I don't know what on earth is going through the minds of people who are like, let's just start this and see what happens. Like, what on earth is going through such a person's mind? It's ridiculous, and things should be thrown at them, metaphorically and perhaps literally. But yeah, what was I going to say? I was going to say something about the corporation. Yeah. So with corporations and governments, I don't know. Like, I don't know how exactly to think about the whole, we're going to be carbon neutral by such and such year, and we're taking this measure, and we've signed up to this agreement, and we've done all of this. Because for me, at the end of the day, these capitalist corporations and nations are about profits. And if carbon emissions are required for profits, then for me, I reckon that they'll prioritize the profits. And carbon emissions come what may.
Yeah.
Now, if there's like huge blowback on them where it'll actually impact their bottom line to have these emissions and to not sort of withhold and rein things in, then they might start making some changes. But I don't for a second believe that they are genuinely concerned about the environment.
No. Look, I want to bring your attention to this report.
Yep.
So it says, it's a news report on The Guardian. It says just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions.
Well, there you go. They're the numbers.
A relatively small number of fossil fuel producers and their investors could hold the key to tackling climate change. I think that's not surprising, hearing something like this.
I don't think it's surprising
It's
at
the
all.
same thing with the disproportionate
distribution of
wealth.
99% or 1% owning 99% of the wealth, or whatever.
Top 25 richest people could end world poverty or something crazy like that.
But that's capitalism for you.
Yep.
Like, that's where the interest is. It's in the dollar signs. And if you've got to pollute and poison the planet, so be it. That's what happens. If profits are at stake, then come what may. Fires can ravage whichever country as long as they've got fat checks in their back pockets. But the other thing I wanted to mention was on the... Okay, let me question you on this. Let me word the question. So, do you think there needed to be something said from the Muslim community about these fires? That's question one, or you can say part A. And part B, of the responses that they were, or whatever you might have seen or come across social media, this, that, how did you perceive them?
Okay, so when you say responses, what do you mean in terms of who are those responses addressing or targeting?
General society. Just saying something about the bushfires. Like, do you think that...
Definitely, I think the first thing is that point we made earlier about warnings and heeding the warnings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I think the second thing is, based on a little bit of research, like it's not enough to just look at one quick article. I mean, it's one report. It looks like a solid report. It's talking about since 1988, the emissions have been whatever. But let's assume that those findings were substantiated by 10 or 15 other reports as well. I would add that as probably the second point after saying that we need to heed the warnings of Allah. Natural disasters are a form of, trial or punishment. Right, and we need to be conscious of Allah. He's our creator. I would play into that increasing sentiment of religiosity within some parts of Australia, that conservative community, and try and maybe win certain voices over. Maybe issue some kind of joint statement or something. But on the second note, I would point to that sort of carbon emission and that sort of thing. I would talk about how like, it's not about or Abrahamic faith sort of view it like this, but I would say, like, Islamically speaking, that in a responsible Islamic model of governance, this is considered criminal activity of the highest. And there's all these international organizations and bodies that are apparently responsible for speaking up when it comes to crimes against humanity, whether that be in the form of like torture or mistreatment, or whether it be in the form of this sort of more like not dealing with the issues of us creating a sustainable future, right? But they do nothing, and they're so impotent that I think you need to point to the fact that this international framework and the structure that's been set up has failed miserably. Like I would go along that sort of line. In terms of how I would address. In terms of what I've witnessed,
did you see much from the community?
I don't think so. I don't think so. What I do remember is that there was an amazing effort on the part of some to actually help out when it came to the fires in terms of...
Yeah, that's what I was getting at.
When it came in terms of, delivering water to drought-stricken farmers, or food packages, supplies, resources, helping out in terms of volunteering, all that sort of stuff. That's really good, and I think
that was fantastic. From
100%. Really, I think,
but my one issue with that was sort of, without naming anything, or it's just sort of a general perception. I could be wrong here, so if you disagree, feel free to not air it.
Can we just get rid of this part?
So I saw some efforts looked to me to be a bit like a photo op, like we're going, we're helping, we're part of this struggle, and all that kind of. In fact, I know a few people who went down to assist, which is really good of them, and Muslim organizations and whatnot. But then some came back and actually said, I would never do that again because that was a massive photo op. Like, we wanted to give supplies to people, we wanted to take them off, and they were like, no, hang on, we've got to take a photo. We got to get everyone here and supplies here and this and that. And they were like, I would never do that again. And that was really disappointing. And there was another brother who made a really good point. He was giving a talk about this issue earlier on in the year, where he was like, we absolutely should help. And I think we saw some amazing responses, alhamdulillah. We should help in the spirit of Islam and how we should assist someone if they're in need, Muslim, non-Muslim, doesn't matter.
But not for the credit of it.
But not, like, you don't need to make statements about it and photos and this and publicize and just showing everyone, like, you've got to justify that you care as well. Hey, I'm a Muslim and I care. It's like, you don't need to show that you're a Muslim and you care. You don't need to let everyone know that you've got to prove yourself. And that was sort of one little thing that irked me about it.
I've heard things growing up about, within the community sometimes, if you look at the topic of riya, showing off, right? And it's considered one of the minor sins of Islam. Riya and tasmi', these ideas of showing off or doing something for praise, right? There have been some exceptions, like, for example, when you want to teach someone, you might want to show. What do you think of the idea that someone might want to do that to encourage other Muslim organizations? Because I can imagine if you were to put the representative of one of these organizations, on sort of spotlight and sort of ask him these questions, I think one of the first things they might come back and say is, and I just wonder, I want to sort of question you, quiz you on how reasonable you think a response like this might be. One thing they might say is that we wanted to encourage other Muslim organizations and non-Muslim organizations to get out there, because I don't think that, given what we have of our religion of Islam, there's not enough Islamic organizations out there doing this. So I wanted to be a good example for other people.
I think that, look, it's justifiable. I'm not like trying to throw them under the bus and say it was horrible.
Yeah, but you already threw them under it and they got mangled.
No, not really. And if it was a bus, it was a very small one. They're fine. But I think it's a matter of degrees. If there's an organization that went and helped out and they put one photo or something, right? Or released a statement or something, right? Something small to encourage, then okay, right? But there were some, I saw and heard from others that some really excessive attempts, and that's what sort of irked me. But maybe let's move on to some of the other 2020 issues.
What else did you want to look at?
Do you want to talk about COVID further, or did we cover that sufficiently?
What's with the smirk? So disrespectful.
Because we inadvertently jumped into COVID.
Look, a couple of things I think we should talk about COVID. And we mentioned one point about how 2020 is the worst year ever because of the we shouldn't talk like that. There have been certain points that have been made about many times, but I think it's worth repeating that, you fashion in your mind what your next year is going to look like, the whole resolution for the next year.
And then you...
And I think it's just so many videos online. When I was doing a little bit of research for this podcast, there were so many videos online that spoke about why I didn't meet my 2020 goals.
Oh, yeah.
Very predictably so, because, it's been a very...
Lockdown, this, that.
Yeah, lockdown, and it's been a very up and down sort of a year.
Tumultuous.
A tumultuous sort of year. Thank you for that.
No worries, sir.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of planners. We plan, and Allah plans, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of planners. We have specific ways of seeing how we might do things, and then something comes and takes that completely away from us. So I think that's a really important way to sort of look at it. But, something I was mentioning before, and we can have a chat about this,
Let's do it.
is this idea, I've heard it on news reports and people sort of saying, representatives of government like premiers of various states, no state in particular, right? But saying that we've got a handle on this,
Yep.
And I know there's two sides to this picture in terms of, whether you should say I've got a handle on this and, whether you should sort of have a little bit more humility.
Yeah.
I don't think, they're going to obviously overnight change their position and start attributing the good and the bad, as coming from Allah, but you still have some humility. How many times does it take things to get out of your hands and get out of your control for you to sort of realize that at the very least you shouldn't come out and say we got a handle on this, right? Just recognize that it's out of your hands. Like it's bigger than you. You're not in control here. Like. I know. I get that feeling when I see a premier come up and there's a live broadcast, like, we got a handle on this. Like, no, you don't. Just relax.
Look, sometimes they say that, but other times they've been quite frank in saying, look, we've got to control this because we don't have it under control. Like, I remember early on the press conferences with Scott Morrison, where he was like exceedingly somber, coming out and saying, look, this is everywhere. It's not contained, therefore we need lockdown, this, that, whatever, right? And they kind of went with that line for a while, and there was like an almost like panic-stricken approach to it. So I don't think that was quite.
I don't know. I
have
felt
a handle
like
on it.
That came
later though. The whole "we've got a handle on it" kind of thing came a bit later. But I think Melbourne came and kicked when it clearly demonstrated that there wasn't. But look, I've also got to say that I think that comparatively to the rest of the world, Australia's done, it looks like, a fairly decent job of keeping a handle on things. Now, that could be due to its actual geographic isolation, because it's not landlocked and connected to other nations. And, they've got a massive landmass in the middle that's just almost empty and it's all concentrated around the coast. It could be those reasons. It could be others. But it hasn't fared like America has or the UK has, which have been absolutely decimated. All right? Like, thousands of cases a day. Like, I was reading one stat how the United States is having more deaths per day from COVID than the entirety of deaths in 9/11, right? So astonishing numbers are coming out from these places. And in Australia, you get, like, if it gets to double digits in a particular state on a particular day, it's panic stations.
Yeah.
Like, even now with mandatory mask wearing and 5 people indoors and all these restrictions that came in, which seem to have been a preventative measure around Christmas, New Year time, it's not like there were dozens of cases.
No.
There were literally
it's true.
Perhaps
That's
a
true.
few cases
you're right.
per day.
Yeah.
But I don't know, maybe is it, like, I was reading one report today from a professor of immunology, I think it was, I can't remember where from, and he was saying that you don't need to be disproportionately protective. He was like, Australia's done decently well, you don't need to shut everything down.
Yeah.
Yes, be precautious, yes, take your measures, but you don't need to go to lockdown grade stuff if you're getting a few cases a day.
Yeah.
It's manageable, right? Like, I think there's no cases in Australia that are in intensive care. None.
Yeah.
And I think there's only a few dozen cases in hospital.
Yeah.
So it's not sort of overtaking the system like in Italy, right? Early on with Italy, where they were just inundated and the medical system couldn't cope. That's not the case here. Right, seems like they've got the ability to trace contacts, this and that, whatever it is that they're doing. But like in the UK, where contact tracing is a big problem, apparently.
I take a very different approach. I've been nodding along and just sort of hoping we move on to a different topic. But I'm not going to really get into detail because I think there's a few other things we can talk about as well. But I have a very, very different approach to it. I don't think that Australia handled it like amazingly well. I think there were some really epic fails in terms of deciding when to open schools, and then very arbitrarily closing and opening them throughout the sort of middle of the year. And I think that led to a couple of clusters that started off, and that led to a whole sort of set of dramas later on. And I think definitely I would say towards the start of the whole disaster, the economic considerations were far outweighing the health considerations. And I think that it's the blessings of Allah that just meant that for us, in Australia, we just got lucky.
Could be that, yeah.
Far and beyond sort of like amazing management on the part of the government. I would take that sort of a
Allah
line.
subhanahu wa ta'ala's blessing is the number one reason why, one could consider whether Australia has been somewhat isolated or insulated from this issue, without question.
Yeah.
But I think there have been some decent management of it. Like, you haven't got a fractured American society, for example, where even if there's measures attempted, no one complies, or there's, the sides of politics clash, this and that and whatever. There's not that extent of division that will cause sort of potential problems with spreads and whatnot.
Yeah.
Like, it could be that, I don't know, maybe it's because the Australian population just says, yeah, all right, whatever, yeah, no, or something.
Yeah, no, mate. Stay at home and watch your cricket, mate.
Yeah.
All right, yeah, cool.
And they just bought lots of toilet paper, I guess.
Yeah. Kept themselves safe.
Global pandemic, what do we do? Let's get some toilet paper.
There have been those sort of non-human originating sort of, let's say, natural versus human-made disasters, right? So you've got your COVIDs and your fires and whatever else. But then there's been a crazy year in terms of man-made, like civil wars in Yemen, and you've got your impeachment trial and the corruption that's brought about.
Yeah.
The whole Black Lives Matter thing with, right after that happened, and that went to the peak in terms of drama and death and intensity. And then they had another couple as well, where they had some really terrible instances of shoot to kill orders being given with black suspects or with people in incarceration and so forth.
Can we perhaps let's just keep America as America, because there's so many things in America. Like, we could chuck in Trump, his impeachment plus the election. That's one issue. Black Lives Matter is another massive issue as well. And then there was one other I can't quite recall.
COVID.
No.
The way they
that, but that's
failed to handle
we
it.
mentioned that with COVID itself. There was one other I can't remember. Election, perhaps. Yeah, probably.
Yeah,
the
you
election.
mentioned that. Yeah.
No, Trump himself, and then the election. That's different. Anyway, whatever. But one thing I wanted to mention, or do you want to just talk about that now?
No, you can go ahead. Go ahead.
Was Beirut. That was huge.
Yeah.
And I think what that showed was just the extent of mismanagement, and not just ordinary mismanagement, but culpable mismanagement that occurs in the Muslim world. The shoddy nature of things, the way that things are not managed, and that disaster really, really brought that to light. And then you had the just outright predatory and disgusting overtures from Western countries. They actually cared.
Yep.
France, I think, was the worst in that regard.
Yep.
Coming along and trying to flex its own political muscle and try and get some public opinion. I find that just ridiculous. That was next level, right? But I think that was one of the key events of this year.
Sure.
And it was about 190 that were killed, many thousands left displaced. The extent of it was just huge, right? We had one whole podcast on it as well. Yep. And I think that's definitely worthy of mention as well in terms of 2020 and the year in review.
What about some of the good things that happened in 2020?
Was there any?
There must have been.
But it's the worst year in history, apparently.
But it's been 12 months. I feel like there may have been a couple of days.
In those 12 months.
I think, going back to COVID, not to suggest it was a good thing.
Do you want to ever talk about anything else?
No, but do you know how COVID was a really bad thing? I don't know if you registered that or not.
Yeah, all right, noted. Moving on.
Astaghfirullah. Anyway,
there's many people who dispute that, by the way.
There's a lot of... Do you remember how there's a lot of good that came out of COVID as well, in terms of the environment? Because of the lockdown. Because
everyone was at home.
And they could...
And Zoom made millions of dollars.
Talking about the good things.
Well, from their angle.
But just in terms of the green aspect, right? The environment and how we weren't polluting it. Not just us, but corporations that were in lockdown and stuff weren't polluting the environment as badly.
Before 2020, I would put my cardboard in recycling bins, bro. So I don't know about you, but I was doing this from well before.
Good Samaritan Hamza Qureshi.
No, but I get you. It's true. I think there was...
apparently it was the first site of the Himalayas.
Yeah, measurable dips in pollution. Not measurable. I mean, substantial. Not
immeasurable.
Seen. They were measurable because they're on graphs, so they were clearly measured.
I'm trying to say it was significant.
Metaphorically immeasurable. Yeah. Okay, we'll go that way. But yeah, I remember reading those reports as well. That was quite a positive. And I think people got really creative as well. Like in lockdown, people got really, really creative.
I wish I had some of my photos. Remember when I was lockdown chef Sufi for 2020? I came on. I said you didn't look at any of those pictures, did you?
Clearly I deleted them.
I had like tons of. I turned to the kitchen in 2020. I said, you know what, I'm going to start cooking.
Mashallah.
I'll try and upload it for our viewers.
To sample some of those.
You did. I made one of them at your place.
Oh, yes, you did. Well, if it was lockdown, you shouldn't have been at my place. Let's not get to that. Anyway.
It was one of those periods where they said
clearly there were no restrictions at that time.
Visitors or something at a time.
Anyway, okay, let's get to America.
Okay. Why do you want to talk about America? I want to talk about positive things.
Talk about the positives of America. Trump's leaving. Okay. Is that a positive or not? Anyway, so first he was impeached because apparently he was interfering in US elections and stuff, and asking Ukraine to monitor whatever it was.
Biden.
I remember this specific. Yeah, it was Biden and the Democrats, and the impeachment, and then following it, he was acquitted, and that was like his massive badge of honor. That he's. In fact, I remember seeing a photo of him holding up a newspaper headline saying "acquitted."
Acquitted, yeah.
And that was like his massive saving grace. That yep, it's all good now. That was pretty significant. And then Black Lives Matter obviously was huge. George Floyd and his death, I can't breathe. That was massive. That gave the movement a second wind where obviously it existed before, but this really
brought it out to everyone's attention as well.
To everyone's attention.
Definitely. And it's so sad that it took such a tragic event like that for it to gain the kind of momentum that it did. But it did. It took off. I know of some schools that were doing in this geographically isolated part of the world, were doing legal studies assignments on Black Lives Matter, right? And it's
everywhere, ripples around the world.
There were ripples around the world in universities and academics talking about it, news reports, journalists, right? News channels.
Do you think that kind of thing will make some kind of noticeable impact?
I definitely think so. I 100% think so. And you know what? I actually think that over and above you've got your day-to-day grind of political movements. You've got, people who are on the ground and they consider themselves sort of like independent news media sources and stuff like that. And they're doing great work. But nothing serves to move public opinion like a global political event.
Yeah.
Because then people are forced to respond to it and they're forced to take a position. You can... what's the on-air friendly way of saying...
I didn't hear that.
They're careful about where they put their foot. They're really careful about how they say it.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true.
Normally, if you ask someone to take a position on anything that's slightly controversial, they will... That word again, right? They'll avoid it, right? They're on the fence.
They'll tread carefully.
They'll tread very carefully.
Around the bush.
Yeah, that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
But when you've got a major political event and sentiments are running high...
It pushes you one side or the other.
It pushes you because it's no, mate, you standing on the fence there, you're on the other side.
Yeah,
Stop. There's no standing on the fence whatsoever, sitting on the fence, right? And so I think that when it comes to big political events, and we might sort of wrap up with this as well because it's getting a little bit lengthy, but with big political events, right, I think it forces you to take a position. And so some of those things that we've spoken about, you've got your man-made... disasters, if you will, the chaos that has America has rent asunder in the world in terms of its contributions to the Yemen civil war, in terms of its own issues back home, Black Lives Matter and the systemic oppression of black people. It's the way that it's treated Muslims around the world. You had Trump banning immigration from various parts of the Muslim world. And then you've got obviously your natural sort of disasters as well in terms of the virus and in terms of the fires. And it's been a very chaotic year. Yeah. But I think one of the things, if you want to marry those sort of the natural and the political and the man-made, one of the things for me, if I can end on this note and you can maybe share some of your thoughts as well, that I take away from it is that, America and some of these big leading political powers, go back a few years and you think about in 2020, you feel like overarching forces are probably some of the strong superpowers of the world.
Yep.
But they sort of become... sidelined. 2020 came and said, nah, there's something else.
Sorry, superpowers, there's something else.
You can say it's the virus if you're secular. If you're religious, you can say it's Allah or God or whatever. Yeah. Obviously, we say that it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that's in control and that's unquestionably so, indisputably so. But whatever position you take on it, it's not America that's in control, that's for sure. And so one of the takeaway points for me is that America is just as much, and the other superpowers are just as much subject to changing
That's
realities as they are the architects of those changing realities. You know, you can't always say, oh, America's in control. America controls everything. We control our health. You know, these conspiracy theorists say, whether it's our health or our education or our economy, and they control everything, or the Jews control everything. It's like, relax. All the Jews and all the Americans and all everyone's just sitting down quietly, subjected to this particular reality, and tomorrow it may be some new particular reality. I think that's something big that I've taken away from 2020.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of looking at it, because it firmly establishes that, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala runs the show and we're just responding. And yes, it may have been a year of trial, but it's a trial that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to give to humanity. And we've got to respond, and we've got to see how that's done. But maybe perhaps 2020 might be one of the formative years, or perhaps it's a year in which it's the beginning of the end for America as the global superpower. That could be the case, because I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, we've seen such a, what's the word I'm looking for?
You got to give me something more than that.
Convalescence. Is that a word?
It is a word, yeah.
Convalescence?
It is a word.
It's like everything coming together of something, convalescence. Have we ever seen such a convalescence? It's got to be done with that hand gesture.
It's got that hand gesture to it as well.
Of serious issues impacting America at one time. Like, have we ever seen that? And if we haven't, perhaps that's where things start to politically change in America.
That's a good point.
Might
really
not necessarily be the global power come even
economically, health-wise.
We didn't even mention China, America
politically, America-China trade wars. That's what I meant by when I said economically, right? You got on every front, America really, really did struggle, and in many ways, over and above the struggle of other nations in the world, compared to its sort of resting comfortably from its ivory towers, controlling everything.
That 2020 was the worst year ever. Yeah. Because perhaps for them it really was.
It really was.
Because everything happened.
Yeah.
Maybe the rest of the world was just looking and saying, well, yeah, maybe. Yeah. But for them, perhaps that could be the case.
Khair, we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for goodness for ourselves and for others in the years that are to come. And inshallah for us as well, for the new year of 2021, it's not some kind of like official recognition that, but we do go by the Gregorian calendar. So for this new year of 2021, inshallah, we look forward to having you guys join us in our podcast. We do have a few new ways we'd like to improve the podcast in terms of improving our interaction with our audience. So look forward to sharing those new elements with you, inshallah, in upcoming podcasts. And inshallah, we'll catch you in a couple of weeks from now.
Assalamu alaikum.